The Valorian Galactic Empire had ruled the stars for 40,000 years. They had conquered 17,000 star systems. Their ships numbered in the millions. Their weapons could crack planets in half. No species had ever stopped them. No species had ever tried. When their scout ships found a small group of worlds on the edge of the galaxy, they did not think much of it. The sensors showed young civilizations. Primitive technology, soft creatures made of flesh and blood, who called themselves humans. The Valorians had seen 1,000 species like them. They would fall like all the others. High Commander Vethkul stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion. He was tall and thin, with hard black skin like armor and 4 arms that ended in sharp claws. His eyes were red and cold. He had led the conquest of 600 worlds. He had never lost a battle. His fleet jumped out of hyperspace near the border of human territory, 300 capital ships. Each one was the size of a small moon. Behind them came thousands of smaller vessels. Troop carriers, supply ships, enough soldiers to drown entire planets. Vethkul looked at the human defense force on his sensors and made a sound that was almost like laughter. 12 ships. The humans had sent 12 ships to face his armada. They were small and ugly, built from rough metal and crude engines. They looked like toys compared to his warships. Admiral Jack Morrison stood on the bridge of the Terran defense ship Ironclad. He was 53 years old, with gray hair cut short and deep lines on his face. He had served in the Terran Navy for 30 years. He had fought pirates and rebels and rogue colonies, but he had never seen anything like the fleet that now filled his view screen. His second-in-command, Commander Lisa Hartwell, read out the numbers in a steady voice. 300 enemy capital ships, 8,000 support vessels, estimated enemy soldiers numbered in the tens of millions. Their technology was at least 1,000 years ahead of anything humanity possessed. Morrison listened to the report without expression. He had known the numbers before he came here. Terran Command had shown him the intelligence reports. They had explained that humanity had no chance of winning a conventional war. The math was simple. The Valorians were too big, too advanced, too powerful. Then, they had given him his orders. Hold the border. Do not negotiate. Do not retreat. Hold. Morrison had asked what would happen if he failed. The admiral who gave him the orders had looked at him with tired eyes. If Morrison failed, humanity would be conquered. Their children would be slaves. Their culture would be erased. Everything they had built over thousands of years would be gone. No pressure, Morrison had thought. No pressure at all. The communication system crackled. A message was coming from the Valorian flagship. Morrison nodded to his communications officer, a young man named Peter Grant, to put it on screen. Vethkul appeared on the view screen. His alien face was impossible to read, but his voice was calm and cold. He spoke through a translation device that turned his clicks and hisses into human words. Primitive species, Vethkul said. You are hereby claimed by the Valorian Galactic Empire. Your worlds will be integrated. Your people will serve. Resistance is not logical. Surrender now, and your population will be spared. Refuse, and you will be destroyed. This is your only warning. Morrison looked at the alien commander for a long moment. Around him, his bridge crew was silent. He could feel their fear. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting to see what he would do. He thought about his daughter back on Earth. She was 22 years old, just starting her career as a teacher. He thought about his son, who was serving on one of the other ships in his small fleet. He thought about all the billions of humans who were counting on him to protect them. Then he leaned forward and spoke one word: Halt. There was a long silence. Vethkul tilted his head, as if he had not heard correctly. His translation device clicked and processed the word. Explain, the alien commander said. Halt, Morrison repeated. Stop. Do not advance. The border is closed. You are not welcome here. Vethkul made that strange laughing sound again. You have 12 ships, I have 300. Your weapons cannot penetrate our shields. Your defenses cannot stop our armies. You are nothing. Why do you refuse? Morrison smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had made peace with death. Because this is our home, he said, and you cannot have it. Vethkul stared at him for a long moment. Then he cut the transmission. On the sensors, the Valorian fleet began to move forward. Lisa Hartwell looked at Morrison. Sir, they are advancing. What do we do? Morrison stood up from his command chair. He looked around at his crew. They were young, most of them. They had families. They had dreams. They had come out here because someone had to stand on the line. We do our job, Morrison said. We hold. The ironclad's engines roared to life. The other 11 ships of the Terran defense fleet formed up around it. They were small and outgunned and facing certain death. But they did not run. On the Valorian flagship, Vethkul watched the human ships move into a defensive formation. He felt something strange. It took him a moment to recognize it, because he had not felt it in a very long time. It was confusion. Every species the Valorians had conquered had followed the same pattern. They saw the size of the Empire's fleet. They calculated the odds. They surrendered, or they ran. It was the logical thing to do. It was the only thing to do. These humans were not doing the logical thing. They were not surrendering. They were not running. They were moving toward his fleet, their weapons charging, their shields activating. They were going to fight. Vethkul gave the order to attack. His ships opened fire, and the darkness of space lit up with energy beams and plasma bolts. The first battle of the Terran-Valorian War had begun, and across human space, on 100 worlds, people looked up at the stars and waited. They did not know if their defenders would survive. They did not know if tomorrow would bring freedom or chains, but they knew one thing. Out there, on the edge of everything, 12 ships and their crews were standing between them and the darkness. They were holding the line. The first battle lasted 3 hours. When it was over, the Terran defense fleet had lost 4 ships. The Valorians had lost nothing. Their shields had held against every weapon the humans had fired. But something strange had happened. Something that made Vethkul pause and think. During the battle, one of the human ships had been crippled. Its engines were dead. Its weapons were gone. It was drifting, helpless, directly in the path of the Valorian advance. Any logical species would have surrendered or abandoned the ship. Instead, the captain of that ship, a woman named Karen Mills, had aimed her dying vessel at the nearest Valorian cruiser and ignited her reactor core. The explosion had not destroyed the cruiser, but it had cracked its shields. For just a moment, the mighty Valorian ship had been vulnerable. Vethkul had never seen anything like it. What kind of species would turn their own ships into weapons? What kind of soldiers would ride a bomb into an enemy fleet? He did not understand, but he would learn. The Valorians pushed forward into human space. Their first target was a colony world called Artemis IV. It was a farming planet, mostly. Green fields and small towns and families who had come to build a new life among the stars. The population was 2 million people. They had no real military. Just a small garrison of soldiers and a planetary militia made of farmers and shopkeepers. The Valorian invasion force landed on a Tuesday morning, 10,000 soldiers in heavy armor, supported by tanks and aircraft that could level cities. The garrison commander, Major Derek Collins, had 300 soldiers and a handful of old vehicles. Any logical commander would have surrendered. The numbers were impossible. The technology gap was too large. Fighting would only lead to death. Collins looked at his soldiers. He looked at the town behind them, full of families and children. He thought about what surrender would mean. Slavery. The end of everything they had built. Then he gave the order to fight. The battle for Artemis IV did not go the way the Valorians expected. They had conquered hundreds of worlds. They knew how invasions worked. The defenders would make a stand, realize they could not win, and surrender. It was simple. It was clean. It was efficient. The humans did not fight that way. Collins and his soldiers did not stand in neat formations and wait to be destroyed. They scattered into the forests and the mountains and the sewers beneath the cities. They attacked at night. They set traps. They hit the Valorians from behind and then vanished before the aliens could respond. The Valorians had better weapons, but they did not know the land. They did not know which roads were safe and which ones had bombs buried under them. They did not know which buildings were empty and which ones held soldiers with rocket launchers. The invasion that was supposed to take 3 days took 3 weeks. And it was not just the soldiers who fought. Amy Patterson was a schoolteacher. She was 34 years old, with brown hair and kind eyes, and 2 children of her own. When the Valorians landed, she did not run. She organized. While the soldiers fought in the hills, Amy led the evacuation of the capital city. She gathered 3,000 children from the schools and shelters and led them through underground tunnels that the Valorians did not know existed. She walked for 2 days without sleep, carrying the smallest children on her back, keeping the others calm with stories and songs. Her husband, a mechanic named Tom Patterson, stayed behind. He had never been a soldier. He had never fired a weapon in anger, but he took his hunting rifle and a bag of homemade explosives and joined the resistance. He died on the 5th day of the invasion, taking out a Valorian supply truck. Amy did not learn about his death until weeks later, after she had gotten the children to safety. She cried for a long time. Then she dried her eyes and went back to help more people escape. This was what the Valorians could not understand. This was what broke their calculations and confused their commanders. Humans did not surrender when the math said they should. They did not give up when logic said resistance was pointless. They fought with everything they had, and when they ran out of weapons, they fought with rocks and sticks and bare hands. Lieutenant Commander Nathan Price led a squadron of fast attack ships in the space above Artemis IV. His ships were small and weak compared to the Valorian warships. Their weapons could barely scratch the enemy shields, so Price came up with a different plan. His pilots would fly directly at the Valorian ships at maximum speed. At the last moment, they would eject, and their empty vessels would slam into the enemy shields. One ship was not enough to break through, but 5 ships hitting the same point? 10 ships? 20? It was insane. It was wasteful. It was something no logical species would ever do. It worked. The Valorian cruiser Endless March lost its shields for 30 seconds. In those 30 seconds, the Terran battleship Resolute hit it with everything it had. The cruiser exploded, killing 8,000 Valorian soldiers. It was the first Valorian capital ship lost in combat in over 200 years. On his flagship, Vethkul received the news in silence. Around him, his officers were confused and angry. How could this happen? How could these primitive creatures destroy one of their ships? Vethkul understood, even if his officers did not. He had studied many species over his long career. He had seen brave ones and clever ones and stubborn ones. But he had never seen anything like humans. They were not fighting to win. They knew they could not win. They were fighting because they refused to stop. They were fighting because surrender was worse than death. They were fighting because some part of their strange, primitive brains would rather die free than live as slaves. Vethkul looked at the sensor reports from Artemis IV. The invasion was complete, technically. His forces held the major cities, but the humans were still fighting. In the forests, in the mountains, in the ruins of their own homes, he realized something that made his cold blood run colder. This war was not going to be easy. This war was not going to be clean. These humans were going to make him pay for every single world in blood. And somewhere, in the back of his ancient mind, Vethkul felt something he had not felt in 1,000 years. He felt doubt. The galaxy was old. Civilizations had risen and fallen for billions of years before humans learned to make fire. Empires had conquered and crumbled while humanity was still living in caves. The Elder Council was made of the oldest species in the galaxy. They had watched stars die and new ones be born. They had seen 1,000 wars and 1,000 peaces. They governed from a massive station at the center of the galaxy, a place called the Nexus of Ages. When news of the human resistance reached them, they paid attention. The Valorian Empire had been part of the Galactic Order for 40,000 years. The Council did not like them. Exactly. The Valorians were cruel and cold and cared nothing for the species they conquered. But they kept order. They maintained stability. And stability was what the Elder Council valued most. Now, a species no one had ever heard of, was disrupting that stability. The council called an emergency meeting. Representatives from 100 ancient civilizations gathered in the Great Hall of the Nexus. Beings of light and crystal and living metal, creatures that breathed poison and thought in mathematics. Minds so old they had forgotten more than most species would ever learn. They sent a message to Earth, requesting a human representative. Ambassador Megan Torres arrived 3 weeks later. She was 61 years old, with gray hair and calm brown eyes. She had been a diplomat for 30 years. She had negotiated with rebels and dictators and corporate executives who would sell their own children for profit. But she had never seen anything like the council chamber. The room was vast beyond understanding. The ceiling was so high it vanished into darkness. The representatives of the elder races sat in floating platforms that circled a central stage like planets orbiting a sun. Megan stood on that stage. A small human woman, surrounded by beings of impossible age and power. 2 Terran Marines stood behind her, young soldiers in formal uniforms. They were there as an honor guard, not protection. If the council wanted to kill Megan, there was nothing 2 soldiers could do to stop them. The speaker of the council was a being called the Eternal. It had no body, just a swirling cloud of silver light that shifted and changed as it spoke. Its voice echoed in Megan's mind rather than her ears. "Human representative," the Eternal said. "You have been summoned to explain your species' actions. The Valorian Empire is a recognized power in this galaxy. Your resistance disrupts the established order. We wish to understand why you persist in this pointless conflict." Megan looked up at the swirling light. She had been told that the Eternal was over 2 billion years old. It had seen the rise and fall of civilizations beyond counting. To it, humanity was barely a heartbeat in the life of the universe. "May I ask a question first?" Megan said. The council murmured. This was unusual. Representatives were expected to answer, not ask. "Speak," the Eternal said. "How many species has the Valorian Empire conquered?" The Eternal pulsed with light. "Approximately 4,217 sentient species have been integrated into the Empire over its history. And how many of those species asked to be conquered?" Silence fell over the council chamber. The question hung in the air like smoke. "That is not relevant," the Eternal said. "The strong rule the weak. This is the natural order. The Valorians are strong. Your species is weak. Logic dictates that you should submit." Megan smiled. It was a sad smile, but there was steel behind it. "Let me tell you a story," she said. "About 2,500 years ago, on my homeworld, there was a small nation called Greece. They were not powerful. They did not have a great army, but when the largest empire in the world came to conquer them, they refused to surrender." She paused, looking around at the ancient beings who surrounded her. There was a narrow pass called Thermopylae. A Spartan king named Leonidas took 300 soldiers and held that pass against an army of over 100,000. They knew they would die. They knew they could not win, but they held the line anyway, because some things matter more than survival. The Eternal flickered. "This is illogical. They died. They lost. What was the purpose?" "What was the purpose?" "The purpose," Megan said, "was to show that resistance was possible, to give hope to others, to prove that even the strongest empire could be made to bleed." Those 300 soldiers inspired a nation. That nation defeated the empire, and the idea of freedom they fought for has echoed through human history ever since. She straightened her back and looked directly at the swirling light of the Eternal. "That is why we fight. Not because we think we can win, but because surrender is not who we are. Because some things are worth dying for. Because we would rather burn than kneel." The council chamber was silent for a long moment. Far across the galaxy, on a Terran military base, Commander Ryan Sawyer was reading captured Valorian data files. Sawyer was an intelligence officer, trained to find secrets and patterns that others missed. What he found changed everything. The Valorian Empire was not as strong as it seemed. Beneath the surface, it was rotting. The 4,000 species they had conquered were not happy. They were not loyal. They served because they had no choice, because they believed resistance was impossible. Sawyer found records of secret rebellions crushed before they could begin. He found communications between subject species, whispered hopes of freedom, shared encoded messages. He found a galaxy full of slaves waiting for someone to show them that their chains could be broken. He sent his report to Admiral Morrison and to Terran Command. The message was simple: we are not alone. There are others who want to be free. They are waiting for someone to light the fire. And in the council chamber, Ambassador Megan Torres finished her speech. She did not ask for help. She did not beg for mercy. She simply told the Elder Council that humanity would keep fighting until they won, or until every last human was dead. The Eternal watched her leave with something that might have been curiosity. In 2 billion years of existence, it had never encountered a species quite like this one. The Council voted to remain neutral in the conflict. They would not help the humans. But they would not help the Valorians either. It was not much, but it was something. And in the shadows of the galaxy, the conquered species listened to the news from the human front. They heard about tiny ships ramming into capital cruisers. They heard about farmers fighting tanks with hunting rifles. They heard about a species that refused to surrender. And for the first time in thousands of years, they began to hope. 6 months into the war, the Valorian advance had stopped. They still held more territory. They still had more ships. On paper, they were winning. But the numbers told a different story. They had expected to conquer human space in weeks. Instead, they were fighting for every planet, every moon, every piece of rock floating in the void. And then, the impossible happened. The Kethri were a reptilian species conquered by the Valorians 3,000 years ago. They had served the Empire as soldiers and workers and slaves for longer than most species had existed. They had forgotten what freedom tasted like, but they had not forgotten how to fight. 12 Kethri warships broke away from the Valorian fleet and jumped to human space. They sent a message to Admiral Morrison on all channels. "We have watched you fight," the Kethri commander said. "We have seen your people die rather than kneel. We thought such courage was extinct in the galaxy. We were wrong. We wish to stand with you." Morrison accepted their offer without hesitation. The news spread through the galaxy like fire. The Kethri had defected. The slaves were rising. For the first time in 40,000 years, the Valorian Empire was losing subjects instead of gaining them, and the Kethri were just the beginning. The Moraval came next. They were a species of traders and engineers, small and clever and quick. The Valorians used them to maintain their ships and build their weapons. Without the Moraval, the Empire's war machine would slow to a crawl. 50,000 Moraval workers sabotaged their factories and fled to human space. They brought with them detailed plans of Valorian ship designs, shield frequencies, and weapon systems. Suddenly, human engineers knew exactly where to hit the enemy ships to cause maximum damage. Then came the Syndicate worlds of Orith. They were a loose collection of species on the far side of the Empire, held together by trade and mutual defense. The Valorians had conquered them 500 years ago, and mostly ignored them since. When they saw the rebellion spreading, they made their choice. The Syndicate sent 100 ships to join the alliance. More importantly, they opened their space as a safe haven for refugees and resistance fighters. Suddenly, the humans had allies, supplies, and a place to fall back to if things went wrong. Admiral Morrison looked at the tactical map in his command center. 6 months ago, he had commanded 12 ships. Now he had nearly 200, crewed by a dozen different species. It was still not enough to defeat the Valorians in open battle, but it was enough to fight back. Captain Katie Dunn led the assault on the Valorian supply station at Nexus 7. Dunn was 38 years old, tall and strong with short black hair and sharp green eyes. She had grown up on a mining colony, learning to pilot ships before she could drive a car. She had joined the Navy because she wanted to see the stars. Now she was seeing more of them than she had ever imagined. Her fleet was a strange mix of ships. Human destroyers flew alongside Kethri, cruisers and Moraval frigates. They did not share a language or a culture or even a body shape. But they shared something more important. They shared a willingness to fight. Nexus 7 was the main supply hub for the Valorian forces in the sector. Destroying it would cut off a dozen invasion fleets from fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements. The station was heavily defended, orbiting a dying star that made navigation dangerous and sensors unreliable. Dunn did not care about the danger. She cared about winning. The battle lasted 12 hours. It was fought in the shadow of a red giant, with solar flares and radiation bursts making every maneuver a gamble. Dunn lost 23 ships, but when the fighting was over, Nexus 7 was a burning ruin, and the Valorian supply lines were broken. On the ground, the liberation of Artemis 4 had begun. Colonel Scott Harmon led the assault. He was a quiet man, patient and careful, who had spent his career planning operations that others carried out. Now, he was on the front lines, fighting alongside his soldiers. The Valorian garrison on Artemis 4 had been cut off from support for 3 months. They had plenty of weapons, but not enough food, not enough fuel, not enough soldiers to hold a planet full of angry humans who knew every cave and forest and back road. Harmon's forces hit them from every direction at once. Regular army units struck the main bases while resistance fighters attacked supply convoys and communication centers. Moravol engineers hacked Valorian computer systems, shutting down defense grids and opening doors. The garrison commander asked for surrender terms after 3 weeks. It was the first time a Valorian military force had surrendered in over 2,000 years. Harmon accepted the surrender and treated the prisoners with respect. Some of his soldiers questioned this. The Valorians had been brutal occupiers. They had killed civilians and burned towns and done things that made even hardened soldiers sick. Harmon understood the anger. But he also understood something else. We are not fighting to become them, he told his soldiers. We are fighting to be better than them. If we treat our prisoners the way they treated us, then what was the point of this war? High Commander Vethkul requested a meeting with Admiral Morrison. They met on a neutral station, surrounded by guards and diplomats. Vethkul looked at the human commander with his cold red eyes, trying to understand the creature that had caused him so much trouble. You cannot win, Vethkul said. Even with your new allies, you do not have the strength to destroy us. We have conquered the galaxy. What makes you think you can stop us? Morrison leaned back in his chair. He looked tired. 6 months of war had aged him 10 years. But his eyes were still sharp, and his voice was still strong. You want to know what makes us different? Morrison said. It is not our ships or our weapons. It is not even our allies, though we are grateful for them. He leaned forward, meeting Vethkul's gaze without flinching. It is that we will not stop. You can kill us. You can burn our worlds. You can wipe out our entire species. But as long as one human is still breathing, they will fight you. We do not know how to quit. It is not in our nature. Vethkul was silent for a long moment. Then this war will last forever, he said. Morrison smiled. It was a hard smile, without warmth or humor. Maybe, he said. But I don't think your empire can last that long. The Valorian Empire did not fall in a single battle. It crumbled slowly, like a mountain worn down by rain. After the destruction of Nexus 7, rebellions erupted across the Empire. Species that had been quiet for thousands of years suddenly remembered how to fight. Factories stopped working. Ships refused to fly. Soldiers who had served the Empire their whole lives looked at their masters and saw them clearly for the first time. They saw fear. The Valorians had ruled through strength. They had convinced the galaxy that resistance was impossible, that their power was absolute, that there was no point in fighting back. But the humans had proven them wrong, and once that lie was exposed, everything else fell apart. High Commander Vethkul watched his empire collapse from the bridge of the Eternal Dominion. Every day brought new reports of disasters. A fleet destroyed here. A planet lost there. His officers argued and blamed each other. His government fractured into factions, each one claiming to have the solution. He had been the greatest military commander in Valorian history. He had never lost a battle until he met the humans. Now he was losing a war, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His own subordinates came for him on a cold morning. They said he had failed the Empire. They said new leadership was needed. They dragged him from his command chair and locked him in a cell to await trial. The new Valorian leadership sent a message to Admiral Morrison. They wanted peace. Morrison received the message in his quarters on the ironclad. He read it 3 times to make sure he understood. Then he called his senior officers together. Lisa Hartwell was there. She had been promoted to captain after the first year of the war. Katie Dunn was there, still wearing the bandages from her last battle. Ryan Sawyer was there, the intelligence officer who had discovered the cracks in the Empire's foundation. They talked for hours about what peace should look like. Some wanted revenge. The Valorians had killed millions of humans. They had destroyed worlds and enslaved populations. They deserved to suffer. Morrison listened to all of it. Then he spoke. "We did not fight this war for revenge," he said. "We fought because we wanted to be free. If we become conquerors ourselves, then we have lost everything we fought for." He looked around the table at his officers. Some of them disagreed with him. He could see it in their eyes. But they trusted him. And they let him lead. The peace negotiations took 6 months. Representatives from humanity and the Valorians and dozens of other species gathered on the Nexus of Ages, in the same council chamber where Megan Torres had spoken years before. Torres was there again, older now, her hair completely white. She had spent the war years traveling from species to species, building the alliance that had made victory possible. She was tired in a way that sleep could not fix. But she was not finished yet. The terms of the peace were simple. The Valorian Empire was dissolved. No more conquests. No more slaves. Each species would be free to govern itself. A new organization would be created to help keep the peace and settle disputes. But it would have no power to force anyone to do anything. Some said it would not work. Some said the galaxy needed a strong hand to maintain order. Some said freedom was too dangerous, too chaotic, too unpredictable. Torres answered them all with the same words. "We would rather fail as free beings than succeed as slaves. That is our choice. If you want to make a different choice, that is your right, but we will not make it for you." 47 species signed the charter of the new Galactic Alliance. The Kethri signed. The Moroval signed. The Syndicate World signed. Even some Valorians signed, those who had grown sick of Empire and wanted something different. Admiral Morrison gave the final speech of the ceremony. He stood on the same stage where Torres had stood years before, looking up at the assembled representatives of 100 worlds. "We did not seek this war," he said. "We did not want to be soldiers and conquerors. We only wanted to live our lives, raise our children, and explore the stars in peace. But when the darkness came, we did not run from it." He paused, thinking of all the people who had died. Derek Collins, who had fought to the last breath on Artemis IV. Karen Mills, who had turned her dying ship into a weapon. Tom Patterson, the mechanic who had become a soldier because his home was worth dying for. "We discovered something about ourselves during this war," Morrison continued. "We discovered that we are not alone. There are others in this galaxy who dream of freedom, who remember what it means to choose their own path. We found them, and together, we changed the universe." He looked at the Valorian delegation. They sat in silence, their red eyes watching him without expression. "The old order is gone," Morrison said. "What comes next is up to all of us. We can build something better. We can create a galaxy where strength is used to protect, not to conquer, where different species can live together in peace, where the word freedom means something real." He smiled, and for the first time in years, it reached his eyes. "Or we can fail. We can fall back into old patterns, old hatreds, old fears. The choice is ours. It always has been." A year later, Captain Katie Dunn stood on the bridge of her new flagship, the Terran Alliance ship New Dawn. It was bigger than the Ironclad, built with technology shared by a dozen species. Her crew was mixed now, humans and Kethri and Moroval working side by side. She was heading to the frontier, to the edge of explored space. There were more civilizations out there, more empires, more species who had never heard of humanity. Some of them would be friendly, Some of them would not. It did not matter. Whatever came, they would face it together. On Earth, Amy Patterson watched the news of the peace treaty with her children beside her. They were older now, almost grown. They had survived the war and the occupation and the long years of uncertainty. She thought about Tom, about the husband who had died so that others could live. She thought about all the people who had sacrificed everything for a future they would never see. They had done it. Against all odds. Against all logic. Against an empire that had ruled the stars for 40,000 years. Humanity had held the line, and when the next empire came to the border, when the next conqueror demanded submission, humanity would be ready. They would say the same word they had always said, halt.